Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dead Gods, an ongoing series where I am to develop and create a new visual story, pulling back the curtain on the creative process. A few years ago, I drew a series called Tellurian, which was an adventure told entirely through images, kind of like a silent film. I released it sequentially, posting at least one image per week over the course of more than 3 years. It was the most satisfying project I've ever worked on, and I want to make more. So, what will this look like? I'm a fan of the Marble Machine X series on YouTube. For those not yet familiar, Martin has generously opened the process of creating his passion project, an updated marble-powered music machine. He shows his victories, his failures, but most importantly, he shows us what he's learning along the way. When setting out to create a new project, I thought it would be cool to emulate Martin's transparency. Developing the thing can be just as much fun as, and sometimes more fun, than just enjoying the finished product. So, the premise of Dead Gods. The story at a high level, we follow the Shipwright on a perilous quest through the antediluvian world. Who's the Shipwright? Well, you'll see soon. What is the antediluvian world? It refers to the mysterious time before the biblical flood of Genesis. I have some key design principles, something I picked up watching Martin's videos. First, the Bible will be used as the primary reference. Secondary references will be used as well, but only as long as they don't contradict with the primary reference. This will be a designing between the lines project, where I'll be making huge imaginative leaps based on the source material. When there are multiple interpretations of a text available, the most visually interesting and exciting interpretation will be used without apology. My aim here is to create a faithful, visually rich, intriguing, and surprising world where you never know what's around the next turn. If the choice is between reasonable and exciting, all else being equal, I'm going with exciting. So here's an example. The primary reference, the Bible, lists many antediluvian characters as reaching extremely old age. Adam, the first man, lived to be 930 years old. Noah lived to be 950, Lamech 777, and Methuselah beating them all at 969. So given that information, if we read between the lines, think about this. Here's a drawing I did at around age 10. After 30 years of practice, I could do this. I'm excited to see what it might look like if I'm blessed with 30 more years of practice. But what would it look like after 300 years? Now expand it out. What might people be capable of with centuries of knowledge and skill under their belts? When they don't just have to pass on knowledge, but can actually build on what they've learned. An extremely talented but normally aged person today with several decades of experience can seem almost magical. We've never seen what humans could do with centuries. What might a hunter with 600 years of experience be like? Or a blacksmith? Or a musician? So as this project develops, there will be dragons, there will be giants, there will be crazy civilizations and technologies, and there will be gods. I don't want to give too much away yet, though. As I said, I'll be continuing to develop the world of Dead Gods in the hopes of creating a new sequential story, and I hope you'll join me along the way. The Shipwright, our protagonist in the story of Dead Gods. We follow his journey through the perilous antediluvian world. Who is he? Why is he the protagonist? The Shipwright, as his name implies, has been tasked with building a ship. The apocalypse is coming, and he has to build the only vessel capable of keeping some shred of life alive. Construction is nearing completion, and when it's done, the world will never be the same again. Before his project is complete, he's on one last journey to collect as much of humanity's important knowledge as he can to bring with him. While his construction project has been underway for almost 120 years, he wasn't always a shipwright. Before that, well, the book doesn't specify what he did for his first 480 years. To equip him with the necessary skills for his quest, we'll have to read between the lines and look elsewhere in the book for clues. Adam was instructed to tend and keep, to name the animals and steward creation, like a shepherd. Abel, his son, was a shepherd. Shem, Adam's third son, was a shepherd as well. Later on, Abraham was a shepherd. His son Isaac, also a shepherd. His son Jacob as well. And his son and all of his other sons, Joseph and his brothers, also shepherds. Later on, Saul, before becoming King Saul, was a shepherd. And his replacement, David, begins as the most iconic shepherd of them all. The book likes shepherds. Given this pattern, and since a critical part of the Shipwright's mission has been to collect animals into his boat, I'm going to say that he was a shepherd. But a shepherd for 480 years. By inference, this would make him an animal expert the likes of which we've never seen. He could lead flocks of animals in a way that they could understand. If animals were sick or distressed, he probably had deep wells of knowledge of how to tend to them. He could effectively deal with far more deadly predators than we've ever seen. He would also, likely, be quite wealthy. After 480 years, you're not the guy standing out in the pastures for days at a time. You likely have flocks of thousands, tens of thousands, and even hundreds of thousands, when flocks were currency. While he has 3 sons, they likely oversee a larger contingent of other shepherds across vast tracts of land. This helps explain how he can devote so much time and effort to his shipbuilding project. With that in mind, we can say that his gear is humble but refined, simple but well made. While he may be able to send others out on this mission, it's perilous enough that he feels he must do it himself. He wears a shepherd's cloak that's designed not just for weather but for camouflage, like being able to quickly become a rock, and predator deterrence. Giant eye marks may not fully stop a predator for long, but it might give you just enough time to think of a better plan. His cloak is clasped at the neck with covered pins that refer to a central prophecy of his faith, a heel crushing the head of a serpent as the serpent bites the heel. So, we have a 480-year-old expert shepherd. Now, add 120 years of shipbuilding. While he may have been able to hire people to help, this project is a matter of life and death. I imagine most of this project would be handled by him and his sons. This means that he has 120 years of tree cutting, trunk dragging, wood cutting, planing, hoisting, hammering. The list goes on. While a lot of this work can be assisted with tools and animals, it's still hard labor. I wanted to make sure this was reflected in his build. He's not just strong. With 120 years of healthy, focused effort, he's become hard as nails. He's wearing a tool belt on his quest, something that after 120 years would feel like it was part of himself. In this belt, he carries an axe and a hammer, both with dual purposes. To imply his age as well as discipline and patience, I implied that these particular tools had their handles grown into place after decades. Practical? Nope. A skilled craftsman could make a new tool in a day or two, but these ones are special, and they tell a good story. He also has some pouches for the usual journey requirements: water, rope, sling, whetstone, etc. It's also handy to have mystery bags for later on, as sometimes you need a character to have something you haven't shown just yet, without it feeling unbelievable. On the back of his belt, he keeps his watertight scroll case to hold on to knowledge that he picks up along the way. On one arm, he has some cast bronze pegs that, when combined with his hammer, become an interesting form of weapon, but can also act defensively, preventing the worst of the damage that sharp teeth can dish out. On his other arm, he wears something that's going to become a continuous motif throughout Dead Gods. They are bronze century bracelets, used to mark how old he is. While they offer some defensive benefit, they also act as an in-world shorthand for readers to recognize how new or ancient different characters are. And from a simple storycraft perspective, Tellurian taught me a lot. It was handy to have some big, simple shapes so that the characters could be recognized even when they were very small. It's also handy to have some pieces of big negative space, like the cloak, when you need a nice big gesture, or frankly, you just want to save yourself some drawing time here and there. Of course, having the details figured out early helps a ton when it comes to close-ups, or even just thinking of cool narrative opportunities later on. Like maybe he has something tucked in his robes that we're not going to see until the end. Who knows? Keeping the shipwright more simple overall also helps him to fulfill the role of the entry point. I intend to design some pretty wild stuff later on, so having a protagonist that can remain grounded and somewhat familiar helps to give the reader a point of reference and also a sense of scale. So, here he is, the shipwright, a wealthy, expert shepherd turned hardened boat builder on a deadly quest to save what critical fragments of knowledge he can before the end of the world. The Hunter. This is an invented character, meaning he's not from the source material, but a character created for this story. This will be the first antagonist the Shipwright encounters, a 600-year-old expert hunter. Centuries of experience have turned him into an apex predator. He's above hunting regular prey. He only hunts the most fearsome quarry. He hunts for the joy of the kill. It's become so honed, it's become an art, a performance, a ritual. He hunts as worship, but more importantly, he hunts to be worshipped. We'll see his followers in the next video. Centuries of refinement means that he moves efficiently and kills quickly. Some think that all his time spent pursuing monsters has turned him into a monster, but he has kept a deep respect for his prey. In the early stages, I explored humanish shapes while enhancing some of the more animal-like elements, like bulky traps, long arms, hunched poses. I wanted his body to look like it had been shaped by countless years in the wilds, trying to match the speed and power of the creatures that he hunted. I bounced around from the overall body to the face, starting with the idea of a predatory prehistoric cat with sharpened teeth, huge masseter muscles for biting power, and a wide brow and nose bridge. Also, why not give him an actual saber-toothed skull helmet? It required some reshaping, especially the narrow cat jaw, but I liked it. As I continued to explore around, the idea of the wide-brimmed hat emerged. Similar to the large eye markings inside the Shipwright's cloak, the hunter's hat would be used to stun and confuse prey before an attack. It also gave him a very striking silhouette. No matter how much detail goes into a design, I still like to keep the overall shape somewhat simple. The dragon skin matador cape hanging over one shoulder really worked. It was a nice big shape that supported him thematically and acted as a great contrast with his close-fitting snake wraps, showing off his physique. I refined this direction a bit more to test it out, bringing in the hat, and this time woven of straw with a high point. I also tested out the saber-toothed skull helmet with this look. When comparing the two, the silhouette of the hat just stood out so strongly I had to push it further. I pushed the physique to be even more exaggerated, with wider shoulders and an uncanny hunch. When refining it, I tried out a face that was both diabolical and predatory, with piercing eyes, high cheekbones, battle scars. I also liked the idea of him having a professional short haircut to keep the hair out of his way. You can see his body was almost looking like something from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Unnatural. Here I added more detail to the hat, this time splitting the top in two and adding collected teeth to make it seem even more like a strange creature. With a bit more refinement, I reached this point, and I really thought I had it. However, after sleeping on it, it just wasn't there yet. It needed a shakedown. What do I mean? It was looking like a collection of parts, but those parts didn't feel like they were actually connected. I started labeling things, searching for patterns, looking for consistencies that could be leaned on. Thankfully, a pattern quickly emerged. This hunter was dragon-themed. I could use that. I decided that the quarry this hunter primarily hunted was dragons. Other creatures were beneath his extraordinary, borderline supernatural talents. So, what does a man have to become if he wants to be an apex predator of apex predators? I started to think of him embracing the creature side. Even more muscle mass, hunched over, becoming a full-time digitigrade, walking on the balls of his feet. His humanity slipping away a kill at a time. His skull, the seat of human intelligence, becomes minimized, his jaws and teeth exaggerated. He shaves all the hair off his body, part ritual, partly to become more like his prey, partly just for the split second of extra speed it may offer. Between minimal sleep and hyperfocus, his eyes are perpetually bloodshot. Raised keloid scarification is used to count and display kills, with the added benefit of mimicking dragon scales. He wears a red paint over the lower half of his face, his neck, and his chest, to give the look of a feasting predator. He could have more weapons on him, but my plan is for him to have a large entourage that includes acolytes, squires, and worshippers. He can carry a relatively small assortment of tools because he can quickly and easily call for more. I spent a bit of time figuring out this snake skull clip for his cloak, but in the end, practicality won out. The shape is neat, but it's too complex to draw over and over again. In the end, I opted for a simple triangular shape that is still evocative of a snake's head, marking the end of his snakeskin wrap. And I think the simplicity of the shape actually works better with his personality too. It's a little bit more brutal, less fine. At the last minute, I started to think about one last element of his silhouette. I sadly dispensed with the hat as it didn't really fit this new direction. Instead, I thought it would be cool if he wore dragon claws in a way that looked like huge fangs. I experimented with a number of different directions. In the future, this is the kind of thing that I'll be asking Dragon Tier patrons to vote on. Since I made these earlier, I went with the version that I felt had the clearest silhouette. After adding some color, I also did a rough battle scar pass. He's probably happy to regale his adoring minions with the long story behind each one. And because this image will also serve as a future model sheet when creating the actual book, I did a quick sketch of his back, showing how a duplicate snakehead clasp holds his cloak in the back and how his red paint terminates. And there we have it, the Hunter, a 600-year-old dragon slayer worshipped as a god for his skill. The Hunter's entourage. While he is certainly a formidable specimen, the Hunter doesn't work alone. A false god that revels in being worshipped needs his followers. They are divided into 3 categories: worshippers, squires, and acolytes. For worshippers, I wanted to design a costume that shrouded the wearer and allowed me to quickly create generic crowds of any size. These are the worshippers that have been allowed to come and witness the Hunter in action, and if they end up as a sacrifice in the field, well, that's just a glorious bonus. There are a few types of worshippers that aren't anonymous. There are the scribes, who tattoo the stories of the Hunter's conquests on their own skin. Also, what powerful and deadly killer doesn't have his share of groupies? The next group are the squires. The Hunter is above carrying his own equipment, but there are many people willing to do anything to get even just a shred of his attention. The final group is the acolytes. These are the elite students of the Hunter, and just as he imitates the predator he aspires to be, so do they. I opened up a survey, and out of several antediluvian predators, the winners were the saber-toothed cat, the direwolf, the titanoboa, or giant snake, the warthog, and bafflingly, the giant centipede. I started simply with silhouettes, trying to infuse the animal theme onto the human form. Then I gave them trophy skull masks and red feasting predator paint to match their mentor. To get a feel for them, I sketched out some portraits, again thinking about how their animal traits would influence their features. For the saber-tooth, I gave him that helmet that I originally designed for the Hunter. Here, he's wrapped in the skin of his namesake, his primary weapon being claws held between the fingers. I wanted the direwolf to come across as a lone wanderer, patient and clever, wrapped in wolf fur. For the snake, while the titanoboa is her primary theme, I decided to pull references from other snakes as well, giving her a venomous theme, with a long poison needle, blowgun, and cobra hood hair. She wears a scale mail suit wrapped in snakeskin. The warthog is the bruiser. I like the idea of combining his immense size and brute force with vanity. He wears mammoth-toothed brass knuckles and displays his victories and wealth more than the rest. I wanted the centipede to be the least human, with an undignified squat, long limbs, and the probing fingers of a part-time scavenger. His cloak is lined with an endless supply of poisoned daggers, used both for killing and protection. I could have called it at this stage, but once everything can be seen at once, I like to be able to sit back and assess. I didn't hate them, they just weren't what I was imagining for this project. They were still too prehistoric, like cave people with skulls and skins. Looking back at my first sketches, there was something great about how unified they were, with just skulls, red paint, and dark bodies. They looked like a team and had a stronger visual identity. So I tried to recreate that, and it helped somewhat, but it still didn't solve the deeper issue. They were still primitive. For this project, I want to design a world that looks like it's been built by experts, by people who have learned and grown for centuries. While that's an impossible task, almost like asking a two-dimensional person to think about a cube, I can still try to vaguely swat at it. What I had designed was largely practical, when what I needed was design, the artistic and creative choices that emerge from different cultures solving local problems. Their costumes had to look like they came from a mysterious somewhere that had a visual language of its own. As this project goes on, I'll be establishing what these languages are, piece by piece. These are some of the first steps in that direction. I also wanted to imply more about their personality and skill set through pose and shape. The saber-tooth has more of a predatory hunch, with arms ready to be used in traversal just as much as attack. His skull helmet is now a mask with a priestly headdress. He is the hunter's favorite after all. For the direwolf, I leaned even harder into the lone wanderer archetype, like a vagabond from a Kurosawa film. I had designed this more abstracted wolf mask for another personal project, but it perfectly suited this character, so I'll just have to come up with a replacement one day. For the snake, I wasn't totally sold on the skull mask. Instead, I went with a fanged mouth mask for the lower half of her face. I thought her scaleskin suit actually worked, so I kept that. I just added more variation in the shape of the scales, enhanced her cobra hood, and braided her hair into a snake tail. I wanted the warthog to look even more like a big pile of wealth. He loves the rewards of the hunt more than the hunt itself, drawing the ire of the hunter. For the centipede, I thought obscuring him more would work better. An inhuman character like him should be shrouded in mystery. Circling back to update the worshippers, I wanted to get more literal. They are there to watch, but it's also dangerous. So they wear these large spiked baskets, first to hide their form, secondly to scare off predators with large eye markings, and finally with defensive spikes in case any large creatures get too close. For the squires, I simplified them. These are people happy to serve their false god, and he is happy to be served. They bow down as they carry the hunter's burdens, hoping for some favor or blessing. I exposed more of the scribe's skin so he has more canvas on display, and simplified the groupie's outfit to be more in line with the visual language of the group. And there we have it, the hunter's entourage, his faithful followers worshipping the false god of the hunt. This video will cover my first pass at Flora and Fauna. And there's a very serious risk of this being thought of as the boring episode. But this is also a part of world building. It's not all heroes and villains and awesome monsters. There's also the world to build. But I'll be challenging myself to make it worth your while, starting with Flora. The story will start in the wilderness and progress closer and closer to civilization, which means that early on, the Shipwright will largely be moving through wild forests and fields. There are two images that I'm using as primary inspiration. Hiro Isono's famous Secret of Mana illustration, and Bernard Boutet de Monville's Diana and Actaeon. Both of these images turn the dense forest into a texture, almost like a two-dimensional pattern or tapestry. This creates opportunities to use simple shapes to tell stories or frame important elements, like the giant rectangular tree that occupies this image, or the perfectly circular stage framing hiding in plain sight here. Before I'm ready to focus on composition, I started to work on some individual elements. While there will be plenty of recognizable plant life, I wanted to explore some megaflora. In the aggressive arms race of the antediluvian period, these plants have adapted hyper-defense mechanisms, from sheer thickness to defensive spikes. And in some cases, they use offensive techniques as well. The predatory plants are my favorite. Here's a giant pitcher plant big enough for large animals to fall into. This is an idea for a deadly mangrove tree, with touch-sensitive roots that drop a heavy barbed seed into whatever unfortunate bag of nutrients happens to spring the trap. I also like this oversized snapdragon with a carrion-scented lure and strong snapping spikes that hold its victim in place as it decays into rich fertilizer. Once I had a few elements, I thought it would be fun to test them out a little bit and arrange a few loose composition sketches to get a feel for them, focusing on using a minimal palette in each. Quick context sketches like this help to stress test ideas. I think some things worked really well, particularly the variations in fern scale on the top left, and the dramatic simplicity of the gigantic palm fronds on the bottom left. The top right didn't really click. It's a bit messy and doesn't have a strong enough identity. The fungus works well enough, but this composition isn't particularly inspiring. Thinking back to that reference material, I tried to sketch up a very simple circular composition and bend the plant life around that. Is putting a circular frame around a character with dramatic color contrast like shooting fish in a barrel? Yes. Next up, fauna. or rather megafauna, because it's time to begin exploring some of the creatures we'll be encountering. At this stage, it's all about getting familiar with the subject matter. How does the anatomy work? What kind of proportions are we working with? Trying to build up confidence. Here's an important design principle I want to use going forwards. We've all seen dinosaurs. They're cool. The versions we think of are mostly based on very reasonable, safe guesses by paleontology illustrators. Some of them are trying to get less conservative, allowing for more wild speculation. Eventually, I want to try to get crazier than them. I'm not interested in the scientific aspect of these creatures. I'm going for story and spectacle. I'll be assuming that the specimens we've found represent the average size, and I'll be going bigger, because it's fun. When it comes to color, I want to let the needs of the narrative come first. So, hopefully these first exploration sketches will also be the most tame versions we see in this project. There's also a world of exciting possibilities when it comes to the intersection of animal and human. Harnesses, decoration, utility, protection, art, there are a lot of fun possibilities. While I could noodle forever, I'll explore this kind of thing more thoroughly as the story leaves the wilderness and enters civilization. Well, there we have it. First pass at some megaflora, as well as laying the foundation for some early creatures. I thought this would be a good chance to pull back and take a look at what's been done so far. Seeing it all together like this can often help me get my bearings. These are still early steps. One day, we'll hopefully be able to look back at a spread like this fondly, seeing just how far we've come. For now, I like where it's going. On the edges of the wild, the Shipwright will encounter shepherds. While he has centuries of experience with this trade, he remains cautious and ready. To design shepherds, I started with their flocks. The kinds of animals they keep will have a major impact on their culture. Back in my first year of art school, I took a fiber elective, and my favorite project was to create felt from wool. It's a fascinating material, created by beating the wool and repeatedly temperature shocking it by submerging it in hot and cold water over and over again. The more harsh you treat it, and the more you use it, the stronger it gets. I thought it would make for the perfect material for these shepherds to use as their armor, clothing, and gear. So I took some liberties and imagined a Theosodon breed that had been selected for extreme wool growth. After their wool's been sheared, I like the idea that they artfully shave intricate patterns in the stubble. In this case, it's a simplified image of a fearsome predator. Without their thick protective wool, I wanted to give them some extra defense, so here you can see a series of metal spike necklaces to deter bites in their most vulnerable area. It also gets some protection on its head and back, reminiscent of the Triceratops and Ankylosaurus. I learned that sometimes ranchers will keep a few donkeys among their flocks. Turns out the donkeys have a strong instinct to fight predators like wolves, foxes, and bobcats. While entelodonts aren't donkeys, I'm going to imagine a strain that occupies a similar role. These hefty hogs act as an active defense system for their Theosodons. I experimented with a few quick decorative options, from scarification, like branding but more elaborate, as well as piercings and groomed hair. Another simple option is just to cover them in paint to make them even easier to pick out of the flock. Shepherds that cover a lot of territory often need to be mounted. Given the uncountable dangers roaming the antediluvian world, I thought it would be cool to give them the equivalent of a tank. This Triceratops has been covered in a protective, embroidered felt gambeson blanket. The rider sits comfortably on top, draped in an embroidered felt cloak, clasped under a bronze chest plate. The embroidery helps to keep the wool evenly spaced during the beating process, but can make for some nice simple patterns as well. For the shepherds themselves, I'm going for big, simple silhouettes. This first one has a felt cloak with a flap on top to act as a hat to protect from the elements. Felt can be incredibly stiff, so it's a great opportunity to create those big, simple silhouettes. Underneath, he has some old entelodont leather clothes and some felt boots. Here's another variation of the thick felt cloak, this time with bronze spikes pushed through it and clasped with a heavy bronze pin. I have to take this opportunity to explore some of the more unhinged ideas. Maybe this one goes too far, but I'm still glad I explored it. I imagined a felt bodysuit, the creation of which becomes a grueling initiation ritual. To make a custom felt suit, you have to endure endless beatings and submersion in ice-cold water, then steaming hot water, and back and forth, until the fibers have thoroughly fused. Once the wool has solidified into felt, the wearer is cut out of it. It has to be laced back on whenever it's time to go out in the field. Bronze scales have been pinned to it to act as an extra layer of protection. I particularly like the imperfections, places where the wool just had a mind of its own. It would be great if those were considered a desirable point of pride rather than seen as mistake. Humans learn from animals all the time, and this outfit mimics turtles and ankylosaurs. He wears another suit of felt armor with a wood chestplate. The main feature, of course, is the spiked bronze shell worn on the back. For this version, I was looking at collars that sheepdogs sometimes wear to protect them from wolves. They have these huge iron spikes around their necks that protect them from fatal jugular bites. In this case, the spikes are mounted on lacquered wicker armor. Woven and sealed fibers can be incredibly strong. Put it on top of a heavy gambeson cloak and you're not doing too badly. I couldn't resist giving him some mini triceratops horns on this bronze helmet. Some of my favorite ideas are the ones that look like overkill. Humans will do some preposterous things if they believe they'll keep them safe. This guy wears an upside-down clay pot with wood stakes and a jangling skirt of bronze plates. Is it effective? Yeah, we'll see. This guy is more of a messenger, carrying supplies out to the shepherds. His prized Quetzalcoatl skull probably doesn't offer much protection, and it's likely a major inconvenience. But it's cool, and that's just how people are sometimes. I had to add another animal, this time a sauropod. Honestly, it's just for the spectacle. They're awesome. Here are some of the reasons I came up with to justify them keeping at least one of these animals. First, they're the ultimate lookout. They're like an early warning system. If predators are approaching, they'll be the first to know. Second, they're like a mobile home, carrying far more supplies than any other animals could, which would allow them to stay afield longer. Third, if the shepherds get overwhelmed by predators, sauropods are like living escape towers. If you can get up onto its back, you'll be out of reach, and you'll have a chance to ride it to safety. Fourth, if you're seriously questioning why shove a sauropod into the mix, then you should ask yourself some hard questions about the kind of life you've chosen to live. Last but not least, predators. As mentioned previously, there are many dangers out there. I thought it would be cool to give them one in particular to be concerned about. In this case, I wanted to take another swing at a classic. This Tyrannosaurus Rex is based on two primary bird references, the bearded vulture and the magpie. The bearded vulture just looks awesome. Why the magpie? Not only are they visually striking, but they can make and use tools, work in teams, and imitate human speech. I can picture like a dozen insane story moments already. The shepherds live in constant dread of these creatures showing up. Their fear has taken over so much of their lives that it has become worship. Throughout their pasture lands, they've constructed idols where they sacrifice the best young animals in the hopes of finding favor the next time one of the beasts arrives. So here's a first pass at some shepherds, a group of wool-harvesting, felt-armored wanderers who worship the monsters that hunt them. Giants and dragons. I can't move forward without tackling them. They are living forces of nature that will make a huge impact on the world around them. To design a good umbrella, we need to know what a rainstorm is. Giants and dragons both represent such a huge threat in the antediluvian world that every design decision its inhabitants make is made with them in mind. With Dead Gods, I don't just want to design giants and dragons, I also want to explore a possible connection between them. And just when you thought you knew what this project was, that connection has to do with aliens, psychedelic machine elves, and circus clowns. Buckle up. First, to the primary text, the Bible. Here are some excerpts from Genesis 6. And it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and that they took them wives of all which they chose. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now there are some very reasonable interpretations of these passages, perfectly normal, rational, and sane. But this is Dead Gods. Don't make me tap the sign. Watchers, demonic entities, descend to earth. They see earthly women and take them as wives. From them, giants are born, mighty men of renown, and they begin to wreak havoc. To start off, I'm going to assume that there was something about the world that was different before the flood that allowed for extreme size. Perhaps the atmosphere was more dense. Perhaps the negative effects of the sun were limited and the positive effects enhanced somehow. We don't need to get too specific about that yet. But looking at the actual fossil records of insects, for example, it's plain to see that something was in fact different enough to allow them to grow far bigger than their modern descendants. So I'm going to assume that whatever this state was, it will affect our giants and dragons as well. Years ago, I saw a design for a human giant. Following the logic of large land creatures like elephants, it made some very reasonable assumptions about how muscle and bone would be distributed to allow for this kind of scale. However, it was still accounting for our modern circumstances, our environment. In the antediluvian world, I'm imagining that we can plausibly get away with much more heroic, classical proportions at this scale. I do still want to account for the scale with an overall sturdiness, but I think we'll end up with a spectrum of proportions as needed. I drew up a quick pair of normal-sized humans to use for scale as we move forward. For this big guy, I wanted to set him at the scale of King Og of Bashan. He comes into the Bible much later on. It's one of the Rephaim. It says that he had a bed that was 13.5 feet long, and that a wooden bed wouldn't support him. Some speculate that bed is referring to a sarcophagus, which is kind of cool. There are some extra biblical stories about Og that are also quite fascinating, some claiming that he was hundreds of feet tall, but others saying he was only twice the height of a man. So I'm going to play it safe for now and keep him at 13 feet. Later on, I think there will be some opportunities to have some real fun with proportions. Nephilim doesn't just have to mean really big person for this. This is a first pass at a lanky giant. Somewhat tame for now, but this sketch gave me some ideas for some future unsettling encounters. I thought I should throw a classic in here too. In the Bible, when Joshua and the spies first entered Canaan to scope out the land, they encountered the Anakim. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Some of the Anakim escaped the Israelite conquest, fleeing particularly to Gath, future home of Goliath and his brothers. So here's Goliath, relatively puny by giant standards at 9.9 feet. Addressing giants also gives me a chance to iterate on some of the characters we've met already. I think the Shipwright should be impressively tall. He doesn't have giant blood in him, but I think that the combination of the discipline and hard work that he's done should be reflected in his stature. Over the centuries, it's like he's physically adapted to the work he's been given to do and the diligence with which he's done it. I'll be exploring this concept more as we go along, but it may open up the opportunity to treat some human designs more like creature designs. I also decided to pull the trigger on something I'd been debating. Some people felt that the hunter's design was too conservative compared to his more ostentatious acolytes. I still think it's the right direction, because his simplified attire implies his absolute focus on the hunt. However, I'm going to restore him to his rightful place as the god of the hunt by making him a Nephilim. Here he is at 12 feet, hunched. Truly terrifying. I also wanted to draw up a baseline pair of Nephilim, something I could use as a reference point for the average. As mentioned previously, I'll be going smaller, bigger, leaner, bulkier as the need and opportunity arises. I added some really quick clothing and accessories at this stage as well, really just to get a feel for them. I'll go through a more rigorous costume design process in future videos. A quick word on their overall design going forwards. The primary source doesn't say much about them beyond their size and evil behavior. To look for a visual design foothold, I've done more research into secondary sources. There's a really wild theory about Nephilim, clowns, and DMT hallucinogenic machine elves. It goes like this. The Nephilim are descended from both humans and demons, the Watchers. They lured people away from worshiping God, and when they weren't just eating people, they were teaching them ruinous secrets. When the floodwaters came, they physically died, but perhaps that wasn't the end of them. For thousands of years since, humans have been using hallucinogenics and communicating with mysterious entities. In modern times, they've been referred to as machine elves, tricksters, or jesters that lure people away from God, promising to pass on secret knowledge about the universe. Again from the Book of Enoch. And Azazel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals, and the art of working them, and bracelets, ornaments, the use of antimony, beautifying the eyelids, all kinds of costly stones, coloring tinctures. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray, and became corrupt in all their ways. Samjaza taught enchantments, and root cuttings, Armoros, the resolving of enchantments. All over the world, and all through the centuries, there is a recurring visual motif that has arisen from the people that commune with these entities. Pale skin, red hair, blood-red noses or mouths, and high contrast patterns like spots, stripes, and checkerboards. There's reason to believe that our modern idea of clowns was a direct continuation of this ancient motif, which may factor into why we find them so unsettling. The Nephilim of dead gods will also have pale skin, red hair, will often have red around their mouths, and will regularly be seen adorned in high contrast materials and patterns. Now, let's get even more unhinged and connect this idea to dragons. The demonic trickster machine elves lure people away from God into their circus of delights, but they're not alone. Centuries ago, there were stories of people being taken by the fairy. A recurring story is that the fae folk can't reproduce like us, so they take people, sometimes even babies, for the sake of making hybrids, creating offspring. Fast forward to modern times, and we hear the same stories, only now with the word fairy replaced with alien. Abduction stories often come with the idea that the creatures are studying humans in an attempt to alter us or create hybrids. Just as the Nephilim may not have fully vanished in the flood, what if that was also the case with their demonic parents, the Watchers? For this first pass at a Watcher, I imagined a large-eyed, gray-skinned, uncanny humanoid, a creature fascinated with humans, seeking to create its own subverted versions of them. Now, how does this relate to dragons? Originally, I had started by trying to design dragons to be more classically draconic. First by adding more texture, like a crocodile, and giving it the classic red and gold smog colors. Then I tried going with something more sleek, with more graphic patterns. This high contrast color scheme, with a shock of red, reminded me of my Nephilim research. What if the Watchers weren't all human-shaped? What if there were other kinds of demonic creatures that sought to make their own kinds of hybrids? Here you can see a version of Quetzalcoatl, the South American feathered serpent god, drawn at the scale of a titanoboa. For the Aztecs, Quetzalcoatl was related to wind, Venus, the sun, merchants, arts, craft, knowledge, and learning, passing on secret knowledge to humans. He was also considered to be a creator deity, contributing to the creation of mankind. In the context of the biblical creation story, this sounds like exactly the way the arch-villain would run his own PR. We also have centuries worth of stories of Quetzalcoatl making appearances during hallucinogenic trips, teaching and guiding those who would dare to put themselves in his grip. So if we have Watchers of various kinds, making an assortment of Nephilim hybrids, what if some of the larger and more ferocious types of dragons weren't just animals? What if our idea of diabolical, clever dragons was based on hybrid creatures created specifically to destroy? In the Book of Enoch it said, "And they, the Watchers, bare great giants, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind." This would mean that in the ecosystem of dead gods, you'd have natural humans and animals like raptors competing with unnatural hybrid giants and dragons. This was a lot of weird ground to cover in one video. I'm definitely going to have to devote a number of videos to each subject, from giants to dragons to the Watchers, and even the idea of physical adaptation over the course of centuries. So stay tuned. Giants. In the last video, I covered a lot of ground, from giants to watchers to dragons. I want to spend a couple videos just exploring the giants. I asked my Dragon tier patrons to vote on what kind of giants they'd like to see, and these are the first 3, but I'll tackle some more in the next video. First, the Beast of Burden. In the world of dead gods, the Nephilim wield a powerful influence over regular humans. Not only their impressive physical presence, but their nefarious intelligence as well. However, in this guy's case, I imagined a scenario where a fearsome warrior giant suffered a severe head injury. This is a cruel world, and since he still has his impressive warrior physique and is able to follow simple commands, he's put to work in a regional king's fields. No rest for the wicked. He wears a harnessed vest that attaches to a heavy plow. It also allows a rider to sit behind him to lead him around. He's guided by ropes attached to a large nose ring. I also gave him some large jade earplugs, a piece of decoration from his previous life as a warrior. I toyed with the idea of giving him blinders, then swapped them out for some large horns reminiscent of a bull or a mammoth, but I decided to remove any adornment on his head in order to keep that wound visible. His handlers include large metal spikes in his leg wraps. This is a passive defense against the kinds of predators that like to hide in long grass. I gave his rider an oversized grass hat that not only covers himself, but also provides the giant with some relief. I liked it, so I gave the other humans large grass hats too. So here's the Beast of Burden. Next up, the Herdsman. In a previous video, I did some early exploration of shepherds. For the Herdsman, I wanted to explore a different mini-narrative, this time involving mammoths. I imagined that in this guy's case, he's living in exile because he committed a crime that even the other giants couldn't abide. Now he tends to his mammoths, dreaming day and night of taking his revenge. First off, I gave him a thinner build, simply because I like the image of him striding across the plains with his herd. I gave him a vagabond hairstyle that covers his eyes, making him look disheveled and reckless. To add to this devil-may-care attitude, I gave him a large mammoth skin cloak. He kept much of his jewelry from his cushy pre-exile life. On his hip, he carries a mammoth tusk weapon. It's not pictured here, but I imagine the tusk is simply the sheath and there's a more conventional metal blade within. To visually connect him with the animals he depends on, I gave him his own little tusks, copper piercings through his lower lip. For the mammoth, I also gave it some earrings to act as a form of branding, as well as some deadly blades fixed to its tusks. Possibly overkill, since those tusks are already deadly, but think of it like adding a bayonet to a rifle. Or is it like adding a knife to a knife? Ad time. Looking around these days, it seems pretty clear that it's time for us to start telling our own stories. No one else is coming to tell them. If you have a story that you're dying to tell, maybe now is the time to start. Put together that reference folder. Write that list of potential character names. Make that map. Design that logo. Whatever it is, why not take the first step? And if there are fledgling stories out there that mean something to you, or storytellers that you believe in, they need your support. If Dead Gods is becoming something you'd like to see grow, you can blow oxygen on the coals by liking and commenting on the videos, subscribing on Patreon for as little as $3, buying a copy of my previous story, Tellurian, or my personal art book. By the way, because of all of you, my YouTube channel has already passed 10,000 subscribers. A huge thank you to those who have already supported this project in a multitude of ways, and a particular thank you to my Dragon tier patrons, who get to vote on aspects of Dead Gods and get their names in the videos. Finally, the Noblewoman. The previous 2 giants had fallen on harder times. I wanted to draw at least one Nephilim in ascendancy. In this case, a noble being carried on a palanquin. Pretty early on, I felt like I was being too conservative with scale, so I almost doubled her. I think it works better, because it's more immediately obvious that she's a different thing than her servants. For her adornments, I wanted to keep things relatively simple, but bold. She wears a simple wrap dress that attaches to a heavy bronze ring. You can barely call that a necklace. Most of her jewelry is bulky for a few reasons. I think the big, simple shapes can be used to imply technical mastery that's still relatively new. Like, it's amazing they can make this stuff, but it's not incredibly complex at this point. They also work because possessing this much metal is a sign of wealth. I also think it's a good visual reminder of their physicality. These giants aren't just big, they're strong. Wearing the equivalent of exercise weights around is another form of intimidation. For the headwear, she shaved the front of her head, and the rest of her hair is connected to her headdress, which has an abstracted horn design. For her servants, I was trying to think of a costume design that could unify them. In the world of dead gods, the Watchers have taught people to worship many things that shouldn't be worshipped. One example, there are ancient ruins in Turkey that appear to have been used to worship Sirius, the dog constellation. Using that as an early visual foothold, I decided that this noblewoman would be a Sirius worshipper, and her servants would all wear dog masks in tribute. At the last minute, I decided to give her some tattoos. The main element is a serpent that wraps around her neck, her arm, a leg. She also has some fang symbols on her face, as well as an eye on her forehead, and some blasphemies included in some of the in-between spaces. So there we have it. 3 different takes on the giants of dead gods. These were fun to make, and there's a few more that my Dragon Tier patrons voted on that I'm very excited to draw. So expect that in the next video. The content is starting to stack up, so I wanted to get another 30,000 foot view. We've already come a long way. Looking at everything together like this is a great way to get your bearings. There's still so much ground to cover. I hope you'll join me for the next one. More giants. At this very early stage of development, I'm going to be putting a lot of effort into filling up the paper. There are guiding principles to this world that we just don't know yet, and it would be unrealistic to think that we can figure all of those principles out first before we start drawing. In most cases, we won't know them until we see them. So each of these Nephilim are attempts to fill in some portion of the dead god's canvas. The collision between them and the other designs that are already done may just start to cause some sparks. I'll begin with the gladiator. I pictured this character as being the grand finale of each arena fight, sent in to gloriously dispatch any and all living things that remain. This guy isn't a slave, he's always been free. He fights to be worshipped. I like this bull-headed minotaur from the Time Bandits movie and wanted to create something similar with an antediluvian creature. 3 different versions were pitched to my dragons on Patreon, a Triceratops, Stegosaurus, and a mammoth. The winner, resoundingly, was the Triceratops. It wasn't particularly close. The big challenge here was making him intimidating. Honestly, I did it to myself. The 3 animals I chose aren't predators after all. Giving him a Triceratops face made him look too sympathetic. To make him seem more unsettling, I created this perforated fencing mask design. A simple metal mask with a crest covered in pinholes to allow him to see. The 3 horns begin to look more like an abstract weapon in this context. He gets a Triceratops-shaped shield with 3 spikes on the front, a sharpened spike on the bottom, and a blade all around the edge of the crest. For his main weapon, he carries a huge tusk that can be used mainly as a club, and also to gore people and creatures at the crescendo of his fights. He's a fan favorite in the pit, which has led to a substantial fortune. While he mostly dresses for the fight, he does proudly wear a necklace of trophies and expensive trinkets. His Triceratops skin cape provides a surprising amount of protection. For him, it's the perfect balance between protection and exposure. Of course, the practical thing would be to cover himself in armor, but since when is anyone purely practical? No, this fighter has centuries of scars to show off. There's no way he's covering up what he's earned. His tapestry of battle scars marks him as the Triceratops when he's out of the arena. Inside the arena, they have the added psychological benefit of making him look invincible to his opponents. Next is the builder, or sculptor. He's brought in for particularly important jobs. His scale and strength allow him to work quickly, and his centuries of experience have made him the ideal leader of a team of human builders. While I think most of the Nephilim's own structures will lean heavily on using wood, for reasons I'm going to explore in a future video, he's often called in for his delicate touch with sacred stone sculptures intended for worship. He dresses more like a priest than a construction worker, wearing silk robes made of enough expensive material that they could clothe 20 men. On his belt hang plumb lines, weights on strings used to find perfect vertical lines. It's been centuries since he's even needed them, as his high skill level means he can find perfect verticals by feel alone. They've become more of a symbol of his trade, almost ceremonial. He has a large pair of calipers tucked into his belt for measurement and proportion. He's reached the point of experience where he needs far less tools to do his job well. He's also reached the point of experience that on his feet he wears sandals with steamed wood curved over to protect his toes. Doesn't matter how many centuries you have under your belt, stuff will always fall on your feet and you never get used to it. On his pointer finger he wears a ring with a piece of charcoal mounted on it. This allows him to work freely with his 6 fingers and quickly make necessary markings without always having to reach elsewhere. It especially helps him to avoid having to carry a messy pouch full of charcoal that's always going to get charcoal dust everywhere. The ring method keeps things nice and clean. He's covered in sacred geometry tattoos. While his talent allows him to sculpt intricate idols for all kinds of false gods, he and his order believe that they can wrestle the secret keys of the universe away from the Creator through the mastery of geometry. The Madam. 2 points first. Point number 1, I'm having a ton of fun with this project, but regular drawing practice is important, essential. Rather than pause working on dead gods to do some much-needed figure practice, I've had some of these Nephilim pull double duty. They're part design, but also part anatomy refresher. Point number 2, I want this project to be accessible for young adult audiences. When I think of who this project is for, it's for me, but at 13. This story is set before a cataclysm that is a direct result of the world's depravity. There's a certain amount of grit required to convey a setting like this properly. With that in mind, the Madam is a high-ranking member of the oldest profession. Her heart has become hardened after centuries of this line of work. You do not want to end up on her bad side. In the antediluvian world, a major hazard of their work is disease. I'm imagining people have heightened immune systems, but bacteria and viruses have risen to the arms race challenge. While many have been treated through the revealed knowledge of the Watchers and the expertise of long-lived human experts, some still run rampant. The Madam covers one half of her face in an expensive silk cloth to hide the effects of an infection. She has lost most of the fingers of her left hand and hides them with bronze finger caps. Her entire right hand is gone, replaced with a threatening draconic hand. Around her neck she wears a few of the skulls of humans she's crossed paths with. They help to make sure people pay what they owe. The bronze dagger that's as long as a human's leg tucked into her sash also helps. I also designed a couple of the ladies working under her roof. They're doing what they can with jewelry, fine fabrics, fresh wrappings, and in this case a precious jade mask and a wig to hide their afflictions. The warrior. War is a constant in this world. Hundreds of kings endlessly fighting over fields, cities, nations, you name it. I wanted to explore a super Goliath, the kind of imposing figure you bring out to strike fear in the hearts of the enemy. Again, pure practicality is not what they're interested in. They'll sacrifice some mobility for the sake of terrorizing their opponents. I wanted this to look like a living idol to the god of war. He's bigger than most other Nephilim, a giant among giants. In this first sketch, I gave him a scale mail skirt made of enemy shields, and a giant shield made to look like a spiked stockade wall. For the helmet, at this scale, I like the idea of it being made like a huge bronze bell, with some extra decorative elements added. This first pass still felt too slapped together, so I tried to unify it more. For this one, I made the helmet even more obviously bell-like, with a huge, threatening mouth in it. For this shield, I tried a version that was just a big, terrifying dragon face. To make him feel more like a tower, I gave him a protective cape, and then liked the idea of adding a ladder into it for his shoulder archer. For this third attempt, I was thinking of making it look more like an immense idol. I liked the unified shapes in the sword mail skirt in this one. Looking at all three together, I tried to pick out which parts of each I liked the most, to see if I could combine them. For this last version, I tried to unify the overall shape language, starting with the shield. It has that arc with a scary dragon face carved into it. I really like that He-Man chest medallion, so I kept that too. His shoulder armor shares the arcing shape language, and I had to keep the ladder cape. It helps to give him a sense of scale. I tried to make sure that the bell-shaped helmet echoed the same shape language in the shield and shoulder. The shield mail skirt, while not unique territory in the world of giant design, was also too good not to keep. So here's the second batch of Nephilim all together. And here are all of the giants together. This is a lot to stew on. Thanks for watching. Dragons in context. In the previous videos, I designed a handful of Nephilim. Next up, I want to dig just a little deeper into dragons. I'm also using this as an opportunity to create some full illustrations, which should be fun. No, again, no. Yeah, it'll be fun. It'll help me to start to put dragons and giants and humans into context together. It also helps to expose weak spots that can become subjects for more exploration. In this case, the big one is architecture. First off, the bird. One major idea that I'm testing out is that dragons are actually a broad category of Nephilim creatures, giant hybrids created by the Watchers. They'd be oversized, more vicious, and more clever versions of more natural creatures. Here, a slave is frozen in terror, having discovered that one of her master's beloved pets has escaped its enclosure. Now, face to face with a predatory bird the size of a giraffe, can she make it back to the narrow slave passage in time? Early on, I tried to render this image in a more painterly way, but the reality is, I just love line. My favorite art by my favorite artists has always been about line. Mobius, Hal Foster, Frazetta's line work, countless others. To me, line is an amazing story tool, like a language of story. It can't do everything, but I love its clarity and the confidence that it requires. So I used this abandoned attempt at a painting as an underdrawing and started inking. I gave the Quetzalcoatlus a copper collar with a long, linked, broken chain. His beak is bloody, but his tongue is clean. He's not killing to eat. As I moved on to the background, this was where I realized the need to do some major exploration into architecture. For now, this house is made of some oversized stone foundations with wooden walls. I also like the idea of Nephilim dwellings being scaled for giants, with human-scaled additions for their slaves, almost like people or mice allowed to live in their walls. For the giants' wooden doors, I added a carved relief that portrays feathered serpents, Quetzalcoatl, Quetzalcoatlus. With illustration, well, and every other form of human communication, you're trying to make sure your message comes across clearly. At the color and lighting stage, this meant trying to make sure that the figure silhouettes were legible. The slave, in shadow, reads well against the lit stone, but the Quetzalcoatlus' high contrast coat and the peculiar anatomy required a bit of polish. The head read well, but I thought the shadow of the doorpost on the door behind it was competing too much, so I lightened it up to push it further back into the background. The pit. This one was a struggle. Definitely a case of holding on too tightly to an idea at the expense of the image. The idea was to have some Nephilim in shadow, watching as humans are sacrificed in a pit of Dimetrodons. Simple enough, right? Seemed to work as a thumbnail, which usually means it's safe to proceed. I went through the process. I like this flat, layered composition. I thought it helped to put emphasis on the scale differences between humans and giants. Background, figures, costume designs, the Dimetrodons. But the further along it went, the more unruly it was feeling. I really wanted to have those giants in silhouette, so I figured that if I added some color, I could see a glimpse of my original vision, and then my concerns would be assuaged.
Oh, yes! I hate this!
While editing this video, I realized one major reason I dislike it so much. Look at this train wreck of a composition. Flat perspectives can be cool, but these bottom layers are cramped, with figures banging right into major tangent lines. The shadowed Nephilim are supposed to be the most important part of the image, but they're hard to read, with their silhouettes being needlessly obscured by the posts. Then there's all these dead spaces. It was a disaster. I created a new thumbnail with a more dynamic angle, with a better sense of depth. One giant in shadow instead of two, with less figures overall to focus on story. The first attempt was just too complicated. too busy. And this time, I figured I'd build a simple cardboard model in Blender to make things feel a bit more solid. On Tellurian, I used SketchUp for more complicated perspectives. Blender's going to be an important tool moving forward. I foresee a time coming when I'll be sculpting creatures, characters, and building up detailed architecture. Later. For now, this is just a simplistic model to use as an underdrawing. I was able to match up the 3D model to my thumbnail, which normally would be a good sign, but I liked the thumbnail of the previous attempt, so I didn't feel safe just yet. I tried to make the architecture a little more interesting than the first version, with some huge tree trunk pillars roughly carved to look like coiled serpents. I also like the idea of creating 2 types of stairs, Nephilim steps made of polished marble, and smaller stone slave stairs. I made the giant steps a little too big for comfort, even for the giants, thinking that they'd happily put up with the mild inconvenience just to make them more imposing to humans. Once the whole thing was inked, I was feeling pretty confident, but I wasn't out of the woods yet. I did my color and lighting pass, and I don't know how it got away from me again. It somehow felt like 2 images trying to occupy the same canvas. Thankfully, Prince Valiant came to my rescue. I recently picked up a collection, and it's become my guiding light. Hal Foster's incredible draftsmanship and clarity are painfully aspirational. I still like the line work and decided to color this image more like a Prince Valiant comic, abandoning whatever my vague vision was to aim for clarity. I tore the color and lighting back down to the studs and built it up more simply. The Nephilim is still in shadow, but it's not what I had originally pictured, and I'm honestly fine with that. The Horde. To finish off, I wanted to try something classic. A small band of brave, or stupid, thieves dare to approach a slumbering dragon in the hopes of stealing its valuable hoard. The most important word for the dragons of Dead Gods is re-enchantment. There are some incredible dragon designs out there, from the classic renditions across history and cultures to modern imaginary dragons. A few comments pointed me to Sawyer Lee's Dragon Project. Check out his series where he's designing a whole draconic ecosystem and the cultures within it. Link in description. For Dead Gods, dragons won't be like classic historical renditions, and they won't be wholly unique imaginary creatures. Imagine that a magic disenchantment spell has been cast on the modern world. For centuries, this spell convinced people that the world is just stuff. It was so effective that people could literally pull dragon bones out of the earth and put them on display for the world to see, and no one would really notice. And this spell would ensure that the only humans that could see the dragons for what they are 6-year-old kids who haven't been thoroughly disenchanted yet. Imagine a spell so effective that being bored by dinosaurs became the central plot point in a Jurassic Park movie. One of my hopes for Dead Gods is to find some way to help put a crack in that spell. It will be worth it if just one re-enchanted person can walk into a dinosaur exhibit, able to see through the veil and stand in awe among the bones of dragons. Prehistoric vampire sorcerers, the Watchers. Fallen angels, confined to physical bodies, bound by oath to sin against creation. Taking human wives, fathers of cannibalistic giants, revealing eternal secrets, luring mankind down into lower and lower depths of depravity. They are one of the more peculiar elements of the antediluvian world. The Bible just barely hints at them, so I'll be referring mostly to a secondary source, the Book of Enoch, written during the Silent Era when the prophets weren't hearing from God. It expanded on some of the Old Testament mysteries. It's not considered inspired scripture, but it's absolutely fascinating, and we can use it as a visual foothold. There were 200 of them. It lists their leader and their 19 sub-leaders by name. We learn of them taking human wives and the giant children they produce. It also lists many of the secrets that they passed on to mankind. From an earlier video, I do still like the idea that they're not giants, but are bigger than humans, in a way that suggests that this particular mix of DNA leads to Nephilim. I'm making them pale, like creatures that largely hate the light. For their eyes, I still like the idea of giving them uncanny red sclera, with reptilian split pupils, to show their direct connection to the serpent. For these heads, I gave them stained lips. These are blood drinkers. The text says that their children, the Nephilim, engage in cannibalism, and it appears to be sanctioned. This is clearly learned behavior. The head on the right is loosely inspired by one of my all-time favorite villains, Mock from Rock and Rule.
I didn't offer you anything. I offer you everything.
This version has, well, let's say, tattooed his face with blasphemies, a way to show that he's fully committed to sin. For their costumes, I want to begin to hint at high complexity. The Watchers are going to be sharing knowledge with humans, so I want their clothing to reflect a very high level of sophistication, even at the material level. We have an amazing character design opportunity with the Watchers. The Book of Enoch tells us about many individuals with some strong visual themes we can use as a launchpad, starting with Semjaza, the leader of the Watchers. He was the first to suggest taking human women as wives, a grave violation of God's created order. However, Semjaza was too afraid to sin alone and made the others swear an oath to sin together. I decided to start out full-blown evil. As the leader, he gets a crown, but to go a little bit further, I made it from implanted spikes. Over his shoulders, he wears a dark mantle with a twisted draconic crest on the sternum. On the back, he wears tattered and shabby wings. In the Bible, not every type of angel has wings, but a fallen angel would be able to reference the throne guardians, the winged seraphim, as a way to display authority. While Semjaza is the leader of the Watchers, he has dermal piercings running all along his arms as a tribute to his master, the serpent. The secondary text says that Semjaza taught humanity about enchantment and root cutting, which looks to be a form of divination similar to consulting the bones.
He calls for the bones.
Oh, she's an oracle.
Many of the eternal secrets that the Watchers teach humans fall into the realm of magic or sorcery. So while each may have a strong theme, I also want them to look like some flavor of sorcerer. Possibly the most sorcerer-like is Azazel. Quick note, the head I drew earlier felt like a great fit for this character, so I salvaged it. In the list of the secrets that the Watchers taught, the list attributed to Azazel is the longest. He taught smithing, how to make swords, spears, armor. He also taught how to make jewelry, cosmetics, dyes. That list could sound pretty reasonable, almost like the list of Aholiab's skills in the Book of Exodus. He directed the entire tabernacle project, including the Ark of the Covenant. However, later on in the story, Azazel faces the most severe and immediate punishment. He is bound by angels, cast into a gloomy dungeon at the bottom of an opening in the desert to await the day of judgment, when he will be cast into the lake of fire. And yes, that does imply that he is still currently there. So he's not just teaching some weekend metallurgy and makeup classes. It's far more likely that he's giving humans secret knowledge to make them more effective at slaughtering each other and seducing each other into further depravity. I wanted him to look like a mix between a teacher and a sorcerer. Luxurious robes over splendid armor and jewelry. In one hand, he holds his smithing hammer like a royal scepter. In the other, he holds a polished stone sphere engraved with secrets. A fun and more peculiar alternative to scrolls, like it's written in a subverted version of a non-linear, heavenly language. Kokabel taught humanity about constellations. One thing that's very fascinating about constellations is that all across the world, and throughout human history, we keep finding similar constellations repeated. The stars are bright spots in the sky, and yet again and again we come across similar lines connecting similar stars, given similar meanings. For example, at Göbekli Tepe, an ancient site found in Turkey, there appears to be carvings of Sirius, Cygnus, and others. Like the rest of the Watchers, Kokabel led humanity away from worshipping the Creator and down into worshipping an impressive part of creation. In doing so, perhaps he didn't design the first constellations, but rather revealed pre-existing connecting threads that humans can't see with their eyes. And while the stars are undeniably beautiful, you can see by Kokabel's blood-stained hands that the worship of them leads nowhere good. There are many Watchers listed in Enoch, and I won't be able to design them all here. We'll see what the story calls for, but I'll end with Shamsiel, who taught mankind to worship the sun. I wanted to accomplish a couple of goals with this last one. First, I wanted to include one of their children, so here he is with one of his many Nephilim daughters. Second, I wanted to begin to explore antediluvian technology. Sun worship is very common and came in many forms throughout history. For Shamsiel, I gave him the first version of the sun between the horns imagery, except in this case, the sun disk is floating by being suspended in a sheet of glass. I'm using this strong glass material all over, from his mock seraphim wings to his giant daughter's jewelry and even her weapon. The Watchers gave mankind secret knowledge that propelled them into sin but also kick-started civilization. Much like Melkor in Tolkien's Silmarillion, they tried to sing a discordant tune, but it ultimately worked to make the creator's song even better. This secret knowledge will be the perfect excuse to introduce technologies that we rarely attribute to the antediluvian period. So instead of dirty people using flint tools, wearing animal skins and roughly woven fabrics, I'm going to explore the potential impact of a range of Watcher technologies multiplied by centuries of experience. So in the next video, I plan to start with glass, so I hope you'll join me then. This is the first in a mini-series of videos drilling down into antediluvian technology. As I work to expand the borders of this project, I have a hunch that exploring the technology of this world will make an above-average impact on all future designs. In the previous video, I touched on the idea that the Watchers shared secret knowledge with humans in the hopes of accelerating their corruption. In Dead Gods, I'm suggesting that while this knowledge did, in fact, speed mankind's doom, it also helped to kickstart civilization. Humanity went from white-knuckling flint spears as they hid in the mud from dragons, to vast cities and globe-spanning cultures within a handful of centuries. Our protagonist, the Shipwright, is on a perilous final quest to collect what useful knowledge he can before the end of the world. The first of the technologies I want to explore is glass. This is a material we rarely associate with anything prehistoric, so I think it will give us a lot of opportunities to get some really neat visuals that we couldn't get with any other technology. There's one issue we need to look at first. Some might be tempted to say, actually, glass is fragile, so in this dangerous world it wouldn't be practical. Yeah. I believe that pure pragmatic practicality is highly overrated.
It's not practical.
I don't care!
Additionally, in the previous video, we've laid the groundwork to introduce secret knowledge from fallen angels. That gives us some wiggle room. With that out of the way, glass is an incredible, collaborative craft. Here I imagined an oversized piece being blown by a Nephilim glassblower. He rotates his pipe as a triceratops is led onto some hastily repaired bellows, inflating the glowing hot glass bubble. His assistants stand by to close the heavy furnace doors, adorned in thick leather heat shields. On the right is a partial mold used to rotate the glass sphere to a specific size and shape. Having the help of a giant craftsman allows them to create thicker, heavier pieces, which adds strength. They can also put the glass through a tempering process, carefully heating and cooling the pieces to create compression on the outside and tension on the inside. And, for a little extra storytelling frosting on top, I'm working with the assumption that their inspired glass recipe, as well as the different atmospheric conditions in which they work, make this glass stronger than our modern equivalent by default. Another interesting technique would be something akin to sapphire glass. In this case, the crystal is grown in a vat, starting with a crystal seed. The molten material is kept at very specific temperatures until it becomes a crystalline column. This is similar to how silicon ingots are formed. While this material can have an incredibly high hardness, it can also be brittle when it's thin. Again, assuming some Watcher-inspired recipe adjustments and assuming they use their diamond-coated tools to cut it on the thicker side, it could be a good material to work with. There's one other option for strong, see-through materials that I wanted to touch on.
Transparent aluminum?
That's the ticket, laddie.
It'd take years just to figure out the dynamics of this matrix.
Yes, but you would be rich beyond the dreams of avarice.
What was once science fiction is now reality. Aluminum oxynitride is a transparent ceramic made of aluminum, oxygen, and nitrogen, poured into a mold as white powder, compressed, and heated. So now we have a handful of plausible enough ways to introduce a few transparent and durable materials into the world. But of course, glass isn't just useful, it's also beautiful. There will, of course, always be a place for the large batch, everyday use glass. Sometimes you need 1,000 identical cups or 5,000 identical window panes. But artistic glass gives us a small hint as to just how spectacular artisanal glass may have been, especially in the hands of master glassblowers with centuries of experience and experimentation behind them. In fact, the more I researched glass, the more daunting it became. As I continued to design characters, architecture, and props for this project, it is going to be a massive challenge to push the limits of what's possible. Shapes should be more dynamic, colors should be more vibrant. The only real limiting factors will ultimately be my own skills and the needs of the story. Turning towards applications, I like the idea of wearable glass, as seen on Shamsiel and one of his Nephilim daughters at the beginning of this video. Here, I wanted to try an earlier set of armor, something a bit more minimalistic and unapologetically He-Man. Large glass forms are set into iron like jewels, protecting the body without obscuring too much hard-earned physique. Glass also provides an interesting opportunity when designing helmets. No need for eye slits when you're able to see through a fully protective visor. I also wanted to dig into the idea of glowing glass. Uranium glass has a vibrant green color and glows, but only under ultraviolet light. And yes, it is radioactive. Tritium glass glows without the need for UV light. And yes, it is also radioactive. Thankfully, with the assumed vitality provided in the antediluvian period, they should be fine. Yeah, they'll be fine. Wearable glass doesn't have to be limited to armor. Glass beads offer a ton of design opportunities as well. In this instance, the dancer wears a costume of glass beads. With sufficient strength, glass beads could also be used as another form of armor, almost like scale mail, not just strung together, but also sewn onto fibers and leathers. And hey, they can be infused with radioactive materials too. Why not? Imagine a crowded street at night in a large city, looking like deep-sea phosphorescent creatures. Once we allow for radioactive glass, it unlocks a few cool possibilities. One would be passive defense systems to keep predators at bay. Scary faces that can be seen in the dark may be enough to scare off a range of nocturnal predators. These passive lights could also be used to help mark roads and trails, or in more nefarious instances, be used to lure travelers into ambushes. Glass is an interesting material when it comes to observing creation. At zoos and aquariums, or behind the tempered glass of a vehicle, we can calmly observe the behaviors of predators that would otherwise have us cowering in the dark. This safe house would be an emergency refuge to travelers in case a dragon or other large creature showed up. The thick glass dome not only offers protection, but it also gives the inhabitants of the antediluvian world the chance to watch and learn about the giants that hunt them. It's a huge advantage in their ongoing push to not just survive in this world, but to thrive. While I'm on this subject, I thought it would be fun to try another approach. This time, something like an aquarium wall, but made from colossal cast glass stones. Huge pieces of glass like this would require an incredible amount of polish to get them to be transparent, let alone to fit together. While working on this image, I started to think even more about the pets some of the Nephilim might keep, like the escaped Quetzalcoatlus from a previous video. Or, in the future, this motif could actually be used for a giant aquarium, offering more of a glimpse into the sea life of this world. Another idea for a passive defense system would be to have giant glass dragon spikes. What if some dragons were similar to birds in that they had difficulty recognizing glass? Create some large enough spikes and it would be a frustrating deterrent that also lets more manageable animals in without harm. I'd also like to explore the use of lenses. The world is riddled with ancient ruins that were built in ways that were very intentional about tracking the night sky. Perhaps there are opportunities to imagine that what ruins we do know about were really the foundation for something even more interesting. They're not just grinding and polishing lenses, but perhaps mirrors also. There are a lot of neat options when combining those elements. With the right controls, you can focus the sun's rays to heat water or or burn a dragon's hide from a distance, or in this case, using a giant mirror to simply bounce sunlight into an otherwise dark section of a palace. And since we're introducing mirrors to the mix, I love the idea of wearable mirrors, glass scale mail backed with silver. I imagine that in the wilds, while many humans might pick it out as being odd, there are many animals that would be more easily fooled. Lastly, there's a cool glass motif that I think would be fun to use, and that's fulgurite. In some rare circumstances, lightning strikes a beach and flash fuses the sand into lightning bolt-shaped tubes of glass. I like the idea of this being carefully harvested, and in some cases maybe even polished for decorative use. One specific use came to mind, and that was for a watcher that I'm inventing for this story. Covered in Liechtenstein scars, his missing eye replaced with a rune-engraved copper prosthetic. Fossilized lightning wings would be used to communicate this watcher's primary monkey's paw gift to mankind, electricity. But we'll have to continue designing him in the next video, which will focus on the place that electricity will have in the antediluvian world of dead gods. You can help this project. Click the buttons, leave a comment, go to my website, buy a book or a print, follow me on stuff, sign up on Patreon. Thank you all so much for the support you've already shown. It's been overwhelming, and a special thank you to my Dragon Tier patrons. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.